building was arranged to maximise the visitors' trauma. Their 20-yard journey through the mortuary required them to pass an extended row of gurneys, each bearing a corpse wrapped in an envelope of shiny white polythene. The stale air was heavy with the smell of decay, disinfectant, and an illicit hint of cigarette smoke. One after another, 3 separate couples made the walk along the corridor and steeled themselves to look down on the bare head and shoulders of the Jane Doe, her skin now starting to yellow and take on a papery texture. And one after another, they shook their heads, their expressions of relief mixed with uncertainty and the fear of similar ordeals to follow. The man with green eyes did not carry himself like the others. His footsteps approached briskly. His manner was abrupt and businesslike, yet somehow seemed to cover a sadness or uncertainty that Jenny read as regret. Without flinching, he looked down at the Jane Doe's face, studied her for a moment, then shook his head decisively. Curious, Jenny asked him who he was looking for. In a cultured, transatlantic accent, he explained briefly that his stepdaughter had been travelling in the UK and had failed to make contact for several weeks. Her last email was sent from an internet cafe in Bristol. The police had told him about the body. Before Jenny could find a pretext to extend the conversation, he turned and left as quickly as he had come. Mr. and Mrs. Crosby arrived after the main group. He was in his late 50s and dressed in the business suit that befitted a high-level professional or businessman. She was several years younger and had the well-preserved features and softer manner of a woman who had not been ground down by life in the workplace. With them came a young man in his late 20s, also dressed formally in a suit and tie. Mr. Crosby introduced him stiffly as Michael Stevens, his daughter's boyfriend. The term seemed to embarrass him, a father not yet ready to surrender the affections of his grown-up daughter. Jenny offered a sympathetic smile and watched them gaze down at the body, take in the contours of the staring, lifeless face, exchange glances and shake their heads. "No, it's not Anna Rose," Mrs. Crosby said with a trace of doubt. "Her hair isn't that long." The statement seemed to satisfy her husband, but the young man was stealing another glance, wise enough to know, Jenny could tell, that the dead can look deceptively different from the living. "The eyes are glass," she said, "so the colour could be different. There are no distinguishing marks, and the body was completely depilated." Mr. Crosby's eyes flitted questioningly towards her. "She has no body hair," his wife explained. He gave a dismissive grunt. "It's not her," Michael Stevens said finally. "No, it's definitely not her." "If you're at all unsure, I'd advise you to take a DNA test," Jenny said to the parents. "We adopted Anna Rose," Mrs. Crosby said, "but I expect we can find something of hers. A hairbrush would do, wouldn't it?" "The hair sample would be fine." Mr. Crosby offered a terse thank you and placed a hand in the small of his wife's back. But as he made to lead her away, she turned to Jenny. "Anna Rose has been missing for 10 days. She's a physics graduate. She works at Maybury with Mike. She didn't have any problems. She seemed perfectly happy with life." Mrs. Crosby paused briefly to collect herself. "Do you ever come across that?" Mr. Crosby, embarrassed at his wife's naivety, lowered his eyes to the floor. Mike Stevens glanced uncertainly between his missing girlfriend's parents. There was alarm in his eyes. He was out of his depth. "No, not often," Jenny said. "In my experience, suicide, if that is what's in your mind, is invariably preceded by depression. If you were close to the person, I think you would know." "Thank you," Mrs. Crosby said. "Thank you." Her husband steered her away. Mike Stevens glanced briefly at Jenny in such a way that she assumed he had a question of his own, but whether from shyness or family protocol, he kept it to himself and followed the Crosbys out. As they disappeared from view, Jenny vaguely recalled an item she had heard on the radio about a young woman who had gone missing from her home in Bristol, a trainee at Maybury, the decommissioned nuclear power station that sat 3 miles east of the Severn Bridge. Maybury and the other 3 retired stations on the estuary had been much discussed in the local media lately. A new generation of scientists was being recruited to decommission the 50-year-old reactors and build the new ones.